Hello everyone, welcome to this talk on building solutions for Teams, SharePoint and Office, and particularly using the SharePoint Framework. Hello, I'm Bill Ayres and I'm a consultant based in the UK, and I'm probably stuck here for the foreseeable future, working from home and spending a lot of each day in Outlook and SharePoint and Teams, especially in Teams, so that hasn't really changed. And if you want to build solutions that people are actually going to use, and you need to deliver them to users without them needing to switch context, then this talk is for you, because we're going to talk about how to extend all of these products by building custom solutions. And we've only got half an hour, so it'll be very much a very high level overview. Right, the intelligent internet, or the intelligent intranet, and this is a sort of a marketing slide, but it's all about empowering users to find things, collaborate and share knowledge. And it's easy to say, but in order for this to work, then these solutions have to be simple, accessible, secure, integrated, intelligent, and most importantly extensible. So simple meaning anyone can create the contents, and it's simple for IT to manage. Accessible because we need to be inclusive, not just for people with accessibility needs specifically, but also it's got to be usable from anywhere and on any device. It has to be secure, because organizations need to protect their sensitive information, which is increasingly under attack. It's a very hostile environment, and they need to stay compliant with regulatory rules and this kind of thing. Integrated, because we're bringing in all this content and services from across the organization and surfacing any solutions that you build not only in a web browser but directly into the applications that people are using in their daily work. Intelligent, of course, that means AI, and we need to make sense of these increasingly huge amounts of information that we're generating every day and use that to make decisions and take actions faster. And that inevitably means that we're going to have to use artificial intelligence to achieve that, and that's a whole topic in itself. And finally, extensible, so that you can create solutions to real business problems, because however good the platform, every business, every organization is different, and we all have unique needs. And this is the great thing about marketing slides, is they have transitions. And so what's the key technology behind all this? Of course, it's SharePoint. That's the technology I've been using for the last 15 years and working on. And SharePoint sites are really the foundation of the modern internet. You can create all of these experiences with SharePoint, which itself has changed a huge amount over the last 3 years. It's fast, it's beautiful, it's natively mobile. SharePoint is what lets you share files, news, data, lists, of course, which is really underlying Microsoft Lists now. And all of that is SharePoint. OneDrive is also SharePoint, of course. And behind Teams, in addition to Exchange, is SharePoint, is really backing a lot of the capabilities that we use in Teams. But Teams, of course, is being the absolute star. It was already growing like crazy even before coronavirus. Now it's become the means for many people to be able to continue to work at all, because they're not able to be physically present in an office. Now, this is a sort of a very high-level architecture view of Microsoft 365 as a platform at a very, very high level. And client applications are crucial, because that's where people are spending all their time, as well as in web applications like SharePoint, Windows native apps like Outlook and Word and Excel, and Teams, which has both the web and native clients. And we're extending those with better Office web apps and Office applications that run on mobile devices, along with Teams and SharePoint, so that the client is wherever you need it to be. That means they need to be cross-platform, and that's given us a few additional challenges in how we can do custom development. And in truth, we've had to change the way that we do our custom development over the last few years and increase our focus on web technologies as opposed to sort of server-side technologies as a means of building these cross-platform extensions. When it comes to client experiences, there are cross-platform frameworks as well as native libraries that are going to help us to do that and to build these either native applications or web experiences. And the intelligent cloud is the information stored inside Microsoft 365, underpinned by the identity platform, and exposes a very well organized REST API that we call the Microsoft Graph. It's a graph because it's not just table data, it's much richer than that. It's a complex set of connected nodes, but designed to be easy to navigate even if the underlying services are built by different people, sometimes with different technologies. But the Microsoft Graph brings all that together and makes a modern standards-based platform on which we can build these really great business applications, either as an ISV or as a line of business applications. The identity platform also, of course, covers the whole authentication and authorization story in a very consistent way to handle those security needs. So bringing all this together gives us as developers a way of working with Microsoft 365 data right where users need it without having to switch apps or open different websites and copy and paste. In other words, it's going to increase productivity in a very measurable way. Let's talk for a second about the Power Platform. Super easy for non-developers or citizen developers, what we sort of used to call beginners, but it can also be used as the glue to connect custom components and microservices, especially Power Automate. And this is because it turns out that, rather by analogy, Lego bricks and Duplo bricks are actually compatible and they can be used together. All these pieces plugged together. A great tool for developers as well, a great way to connect components or services, especially in a microservices architecture, and do things in a very decoupled way. So as developers, we have to do our due diligence and look at the Power Platform, and we need to understand what it can do and understand that it's not an either or. We can use both. We might do some custom code development, but use that in conjunction with the Power Platform, Power Automate and Power Apps to build out the whole solution. It's up to us to decide what's the best approach. We can use full-on development and then use these as the glue to wire everything together, if you'll forgive the mixed metaphor. But we tend to find that at least some business requirements, if not all, need proper, quotes, proper development. And to do this, we haven't, as you might think, developed the next iteration of the Visual Studio development environment or invented some super powerful Power Apps platform. We've actually gone back to the command prompt, and just hold that thought. So we've kind of gone back to doing development really at the command line rather than using visual tools. And that's kind of the way that web developers have moved. So we're familiar with no-code options like Power Apps and Power Automate. They don't get us quite where we want to be, and to be honest, that suits us a little bit because we're developers, right? We want to write code, it's what we do, and we need to extend these canvases. Canvases? What do I mean by canvases? Well, when we extend SharePoint, that's the pages, or Teams, that's conversations, or Office documents, Office apps, that's the documents, then what we're really doing is extending that canvas. And we install one of these canvas extensions and associate it with a manifest file, which is the connection between the canvas, the SharePoint page, the team, the Office application, and a remote website, or possibly a remote service. Then that's what then gets presented back into the canvas. And the remote site can then use whatever web technology you like. So that could be Node.js, it could be ASP.NET, it could be PHP, or quite commonly what we can use is static sites, a static website, with or without some client-side code, which itself may or may not use a client-side framework like Angular or React.js. So these are all popular web development tools, and because of a lot of these build tools use Node.js, both to support development tools like Yeoman and also to serve content as part of the development, then we can use any operating system we like to develop on. And so we're not really using Visual Studio so much nowadays. We probably, as a code editor, we'd use Visual Studio Code, which is very popular in the broader web development community. Now, if you come from a pure .NET development background, there's some new stuff to learn, but totally worth it. So you hate JavaScript, then do what a lot of people do, is learn TypeScript, which will be a much easier transition from C# development, for example, or Java. So that's our modern development toolchain. Now, that's what we use in the SharePoint framework. We've had a number of ways of extending SharePoint over the years, but the recommended way nowadays is to use the SharePoint framework, which is using these modern development tools that I was just talking about. It differs from the earlier approaches because we're using open source development techniques and tooling that are very widely adopted in the web development world. And in years past, to be honest, it sometimes felt as though, say, when we were writing full trust applications running on the server, it felt as though we were just a little bit trapped in a slightly legacy world, or we were using an old version of ASP.NET, or we were using web forms when everybody was using ASP.NET MVC and struggling to work out how to use SharePoint pages in conjunction with the latest JavaScript libraries. No more. You can now use whatever frameworks and development techniques you like, and obviously we have some recommendations, but really ultimately it's up to you what you use. And if you choose to use Ruby on Rails and Angular v1 and develop in Emacs on an old Sun workstation, as long as you can install Node.js, that's totally fine. And it's these techniques are also used by Microsoft to build products, which has had a big impact on quality. So that wasn't always the case with some of the earlier technologies, and it's got applications beyond SharePoint. And it isn't just code, it's a whole package of build process and deployment tools. There's a built-in SharePoint CDN that you can use to deploy assets in your solution. Surprisingly, for long-term Microsoft developers, the build process and tooling does not revolve around Visual Studio as we discussed. Instead, you use any editor, but most people are using Visual Studio Code, along with open source tooling that we mentioned. And yes, we are at the command prompt. This is the SharePoint Framework Yeoman generator, which is doing the job of file new project in an IDE like Visual Studio, scaffolding out some files, and certainly check the ASCII art, which might be a familiar concept if you did programming about 30 or 40 years ago. It does feel as though we've gone back to the command line, but while we do this demo, we've only got 30 minutes, so I'm just going to talk in parallel. So we've gone back to the command line because IDEs are complex and slow, and we've actually kind of moved away from that approach. I think a few years ago we thought we'd have WYSIWYG development tools for web development, and that's not really what web developers are using there. You've gone back to this sort of command line approach. Now this is Visual Studio Code, which is fundamentally a simple code editor, although you can actually add extensions that make it quite sophisticated. And here's our project structure, except it's not really a project, it's just a file hierarchy, and we've got a number of configuration files and manifest files. And I'll give you some links to get all that information because we don't really have time to go into it in detail now, but look out for the links later in the slide deck, which you should be able to get a copy of. And we will do a gulp serve, which is using gulp is like the task running tool, and that will start up the SharePoint workbench, which is a page served locally. It's not a real SharePoint page, we'll just wait for it to come up. So we're not using anything server-side at all here. So this is the SharePoint workbench. I don't have to set up SharePoint just to get this page working. It'll all run locally, and you can see from the URL that it's just running on my local machine. But that's the idea. I have this web content hosted somewhere, and this is then going to be surfaced in SharePoint. And when we deploy this web part, it's going to end up in the app catalog, which is really just a SharePoint list, and we'll look at that in a minute or two. But what I can do is then extend this a little bit. So I've started with the sort of the Hello World project and added a few extra bits of code here. It's pulling in some information from Azure Blob Storage, and we can see that render in a second. We've done a bit of restyling of it here. This is using the React framework. Page eventually reloads. We can see that we've now got a slightly more sophisticated web part, and it's able to pull information in from various locations. Now, when we look at Teams, we can see that it's designed to be extensible with lots of extension points, bots and messaging extensions and connectors, but we're actually going to focus on Teams tabs, which appear along the top of the pane when you're looking at your channel. And that's by far the easiest way to extend Teams. A tab can just be some external web page or website, and you can also have conversations around it. So you see how, again, there's a manifest file behind the scenes, and that manifest points to the web content, which might just be a simple page or something more complex with some interaction with Microsoft 365 using the Microsoft Graph. As before, you need to host that somewhere. It might be an external website, or you might stand up an Azure web page or Azure web app, or maybe just use a SharePoint page. But now we have the option to bring SharePoint web parts, SharePoint Framework web parts, right into Teams. So I can use the web part we just built right inside Teams, which makes a lot of sense if we're having a discussion as a team and we're working on that content. We can bring it right into Teams. Now, it might be that you design a web part for both situations, i.e. Teams and for use in SharePoint, or you might build something specifically for Teams but as a web part. It just depends on what you're building. It might not make sense for you to use the same component in both places, and you have control over that in the manifest, whether you want it to render in SharePoint or Teams or both. So let's see how we can take that web part that we just built and deploy it in Teams. We're just going to go through the steps of rebuilding it, and first I have to go to this manifest file, which is the web part manifest file, and add another option here into supported hosts. And you can see there's a bit of IntelliSense that allows me to add a Teams tab or a personal Teams tab. Now we have to do a couple of things at the command line. We have to do we'll do a build first. We need to do a gulp bundle -- ship, which will build the bundle for us using a tool called Webpack, another widely used web development tool. And then we'll do gulp package solution -- ship, which will then package that up as a SharePoint framework using actually something very similar to the old add-in model, and give us a file that we can then deploy to the app catalog. And once that's done, I can look into my SharePoint folder. I'll see there's an SP package, and I can actually drop that onto, here's my web part, go down into SharePoint, and I can dig around, find that SP package file. So this is just the normal deployment process for deploying a web part to SharePoint. So I have to search around a little bit to find the SharePoint app catalog. There's quite a few ways of getting to this. I'm going to go to somewhere around here, apps, and go to the app catalog, and then we can say apps for SharePoint, and now we can take that file and drop it into the app catalog, which is what I'm going to do here. And once it's in there, I need to find it. It will offer me the option of deploying it tenant-wide, which I do want to select. That will make things a lot easier to deploy to Teams. And then I need to find the package that I just uploaded, and then you'll see that this Sync to Teams button lights up because I added that extra option to the manifest file a couple of minutes ago. So that gives me the option to sync to Teams, and what that will do is generate a manifest file in Teams, which I'll be able to see. I won't be able to see it initially. We'll need to refresh this page. And then that web part that we just created will now be available as a tab. So I can add this, say add a new one, and you can see I've deployed this a few times, and somewhere down here there'll be one called Facilitate. That's the one we just created, and I can add that, and it will then, once I go through this configuration dialog, I'm going to save that, and it then appears, the web part appears as a tab. It's all nicely formatted. It's got its configuration, and that is the same web part, but now rendered as a Teams tab. So a great solution. So we've done SharePoint and Teams. Moving on now to Office. Now, I've seen many businesses that have grown rapidly, and they end up with ridiculous processes where order numbers are written on a piece of paper and transcribed to another system, and copying and pasting, especially small businesses, and they can't justify a large custom ERP solution and so forth. And these are really manual processes. And this is really an ideal case for the Office add-in type of approach that can achieve automation but in a seamless way, and that could be as an ISV, but I'm particularly thinking here of the line of business application that's custom built, and to the end user it just feels like part of the Office application they've been using, and that's because the add-in is using the same look and feel but in a cross-platform way, using the same manifest driven approach that we've been discussing. So let's see how that works in Outlook. So here's an add-in for Outlook that we've created. It's called Reactor, and you can get it from the store if you want to try it. It's an email response tool that can help you deal with all those emails that are almost spam but not quite, and uses pre-written responses. And it renders in a web control like an iframe, literally in the case of the Outlook web app, or on the desktop versions using the Web Extensibility Framework. It's built using open web standards. There's a JavaScript library called Office.js, and that's our bridge to the hosting app context, in this case the selected email. You get a control added in the ribbon, and that's how the add-in shows up when it's installed. Again, you've got some control over this. And that's to say that the manifest file, when I say install, the manifest file gets installed, because that's really the key to all of these extensions. Now, in the case of these Office add-ins, it's an XML manifest file. You might remember it was a JSON file that we used in SharePoint and Teams extensions, because these Office add-ins are actually a slightly older technology, but it's fundamentally working the same way. And that points to the add-in website that's hosted somewhere, and again that can be using any technology you like. Back-end, front-end, ASP.NET, whatever, as before. It might have code running or may just serve some static content, which is usually what's happening in this case. And that's what gets rendered in the page. And now we can use Office.js to look at the message content and decide on an appropriate response. In this case, it's going to be thank you. We don't need web development. We can figure it out because we're kind of web developers. And the same principle applies to other Office applications as well, PowerPoint, SharePoint, Excel, and there are other extension points for them as well. But that's the basic idea behind the Office add-in. So you've got a number of options for building Office add-ins. The first is a tool which is actually an add-in itself called ScriptLab, which lets you take a sample solution and edit it right inside Office, a sort of meta add-in that's got a code editor and some samples to get you started. That's a great tool for experimenting and prototyping. As a pro developer, you probably want to use more of a development environment with source control and lifecycle management. And one option is Visual Studio, which does have good support for building Office add-ins, and not so much for the SharePoint framework that we talked about before, but good Office add-in support. But you could also use the same tool chain as we did for the SharePoint framework earlier. Remember that the add-in is really just a website, so you can use any web development tool or editor, and Visual Studio Code is a particularly popular option here. And there's also a Yeoman generator for Office add-ins, so I can use Yo Office to scaffold out the solution and use the same approach as we used in the SharePoint framework example earlier. So we're using the same techniques, the same skills. Now that's great, but as we talked about with Teams, you still have to host the web content somewhere. So what if we could just use SharePoint and the SharePoint framework? That would solve our hosting problem because we could just host the content in SharePoint, and it also solves the problem of managing tokens to get access to the Microsoft graph and all that Microsoft 365 data, which can be a tricky problem in itself, but that's a solved problem in the SharePoint framework. So this is still in preview, and it's only available for Outlook and Outlook web application at that, so it's early days, but you can now use the SharePoint framework to build a web part and have that show up as an Office add-in. Now I don't have time to go into the details, but there's a bit more information in this link on the slide here, and remember it's currently in preview, not available for Word or Excel, etc. But potentially, we can build the same component and use it in SharePoint and Teams and Outlook. And so the question then is, is that a good idea? Well, it might be, if you have to think about the specific application and think whether that really makes sense, and it all depends on what you're building. It might work, but these are different applications, and it's really pretty unlikely that the same exact functionality or UI would make sense in SharePoint and Teams and in Office applications. So I wouldn't recommend trying to come up with some sort of universal all-singing, all-dancing extension that works everywhere. Rather, try to keep things simple, follow these design guidelines that I'm bringing up at the moment, and think of this as more of an opportunity to reuse your development skills and maybe a bit of code reuse as well. And remember to keep it simple and try to do one thing for the user and do it well and without too much branding and complexity. And generally follow these design tips that apply whether you're building for SharePoint or Teams or Office. And I've got a link here to give you some more learning resources if you want to find out more. So there it is. The SharePoint framework can be used to build for SharePoint and Teams and Office, and all using modern development techniques and libraries. Sign up for the Microsoft 365 Developer Program, formerly known as the Office 365 Developer Program, and there's lots of documentation and sample code and how-to videos to get you started if you're new to this. And start thinking about some of your own business challenges and how you could solve them using these development options. Just a very quick overview, but I hope it was useful. Thanks very much.